Okay, so what happened is the South doesn't leave the Union simultaneously, as I just said. And what happens is what Duke calls ambassadors of disunion from the lower South states, they fan across the upper South in order to convince the upper South to leave the Union. Now, eventually they're going to succeed everywhere but in Kentucky. But that's the period that Charles Dew is looking at. That basically folks from the lower South, all the way from Texas to South Carolina, white folk, white men in particular, white elites, slave owning elites, during this period where the upper South is kind of teetering on what to do, they send what Dew calls ambassadors of disunion to these states to try to convince these folks to join them, to join the Confederacy. And it's a very interesting technical point. Historians have known about these, what Dew calls apostles of disunion. That's the name of his book, Apostles of Disunion, for a long time. And now you can access most of their speeches online. But Dew's the first person really to look at them carefully and look at their writings carefully because he has an argument that he wants to make. And this is what we do as historians. As I said in the first podcast, it's amazing to me how many people out there will still argue that the South left the Union not because of issues of slavery and emancipation, but the South left the Union over technical questions about the political rights of individual states that have very little to do or had very little to do with slavery. You still hear this a lot. So what Dew's point is, and he has a very interesting introduction, which I'm not having you read. He wants to demolish this argument. He grew up in Virginia. This is what he heard when he was growing up as a kid, and then he went to Williams College, and that's where his career's been at Williams College, and which is in Massachusetts. And he wants to really examine this question about states' rights versus fear of emancipation with a very critical eye. And what he does, long story short, is he uses these so-called apostles of disunion, these elite white slaveholders who fan out across the upper South in order to convince the southern whites who are kind of teetering on the fence, in order to convince them to leave the Union and join the lower South to create the new nation, the Confederacy. He's looking at their speeches, and he's trying to discern a pattern in these speeches. And he's trying to see how much the issue of slavery and the fear of slave emancipation and the fear that the domination of whites over African Americans, that would end under the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, how much this played a role in what these apostles of disunion were talking about when they talked to their fellow whites and tried to convince them that they needed to leave the United States and join the Confederacy. So he's going in with a hypothesis, I guess you'd say, that fear of emancipation and the loss of racial subordination, white over black, this is what he thinks that these apostles of disunion will be arguing. He thinks that this will be central to their argument. That when they talk to their fellow white slaveholders in the Upper South, they'll be stressing to them, you need to leave the United States because Abraham Lincoln is now president and he is going to jam emancipation down our throats immediately. And again, as I said before, the complexities or the subtleties of Lincoln's kind of gradualist position was lost on these men. They thought the emergency was now. So that's what Dew does. He goes and looks at documents. Oh, I want to show you put the map up. So again, I'm talking about folks from the lower South that go in and talk to slaveholders in the upper South. That are teetering on the edge. So and this is a period between, say, January of 1861 and late April of 1861, when the Civil War begins, in states like Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee and Arkansas ultimately do join the Confederacy. Lincoln's successful in keeping Kentucky and Missouri in the Union. Okay, so this is the long setup, maybe too long for some of you. So from a technical point of view, what Dew does is something very clever. He looks at these men, and he looks at these speeches, and he's trying to figure out, what are they saying? How are they trying to convince their fellow whites to leave the Union? And probably not surprisingly, what he finds is that fear of emancipation and fear of the loss of racial dominance was at the very center of the appeal of these Southern whites to their fellow slaveholders. So, as you probably have guessed by now, Dew, in his book, he makes the argument that those that claim, in contemporary times, that the South left the Union over a strictly political question, the question of the rights of individual states versus the federal government, are incorrect. That might have been, let's put it as a formula, that might have been 5% of why Southern whites left the Union, but 95% was fear of emancipation and fear of the loss of white racial dominance over African Americans. That overwhelmingly, these apostles of disunion are focusing on what they would see as the complete disaster of emancipation. This is which they think that Lincoln is going to force down the throats of Southerners as soon as he becomes president. This is their argument to their fellow whites, that Lincoln is dangerous because he is going to create immediate emancipation of slaves. So Dew makes the argument that fear of emancipation and fear of the loss of of white dominance over black people was absolutely at the center of why Southern whites left the Union. It's kind of amazing to me that people still argue the states' rights argument, and really it's pretty easy to demolish. It's really the state's right to own a slave, right? It all comes back to slavery. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. What we're looking at is technique here. But I'm setting up Dew because you're only reading one chapter of Dew, and I think hopefully this will make more sense. So yeah, that's the technique at play. I just want to say real briefly, one of the things that Southern whites basically lost the war, but kind of won the memory of the Civil War for about 100 years. This has nothing to do with your 4973 paper, but for some of you, you might find it interesting. And during the Civil War, Alexander Stephens, who was the Vice President of the United States of the Confederacy, early in the Civil War, he said slavery is the cornerstone of the Confederacy. He said this in 1861. It's very interesting. After the war, he said, no, this is fake news, in effect. He said, I never said that. I never said that slavery is the cornerstone of the Confederacy. Fake news, fake news. Well, Dew's gone, and he's looked at 2 or 3 newspapers, and he's found a similar account in these newspapers. And that cornerstone speech was very embarrassing for Stephens after the war, because basically Southern white leaders who were defeated, such as Jefferson Davis, who had talked about slavery throughout the war, they tried to cover up after the war the importance of slavery as a cause of secession. And they were pretty darn successful for reasons I really can't go into in this course. So that's one of the reasons that someone like Dew, and this book comes out like 2001, 2002, something like that, as late as the 2000s and even up until this day, you know, Southern white leaders who tried to cover up the importance of fear of emancipation in the post-Civil War period as a cause of secession were pretty amazingly successful, although people are chipping away, historians are chipping away at this argument, and Dew does a terrific job of that. Now, that has nothing to do with the papers that you're writing, but you're historians or history majors, I thought you might find that interesting. Now, in the next podcast, though, I'm going to go back to technique, which is what I'm sure you're interested in, and what I'm trying to have you get from reading DewP.